I know there are some of you who probably want to hear more poetry, so what we're going to try and do is to intersperse this conversation with poems if we can. It just struck me when I was sitting here what a difficult business poetry reading is actually. And I want to start just by congratulating Anand on a very fine reading and on two very strong, very distinctive, very varied books. I mentioned this in my blurb to one of the books and I just want to repeat it here. I think what I've often felt, what draws me to Anand's work, is a certain fascination with really the materiality of things, a great need to feel their texture, their grain, a sensuousness. And at the same time, there's also this need seemingly to a kind of itch to probe those surfaces, not quite knowing why, because their sensuousness ought to be perhaps enough reward, and yet it's not. And I recognize that itch, and I feel a certain affinity with that, because I do know that in some strange way that's also what motivates me to write poetry. I'm going to just start by asking you easy questions, Anand, and we'll keep it easy throughout. I think the question that we're going to encounter, perhaps later on, which we may as well deal with now, which is from Waking in December, which happened in 2001?
Yeah, 10 years ago.
10 years ago. To these two books, and how you feel, how would you map your journey from Waking in December to these? I think to people who've heard your work, some of those differences may be apparent, but it's always useful to know how a poet sees that journey.
I think elephant bathing, at least for me, is very much in terms of its strategies and aesthetics, a development of what was begun in Waking in December. My concern with classical forms, with meter, with the sort of poem that cuts off a hell of a lot of unnecessary material for the sake of form remains a very important concern throughout elephant bathing, with exceptions. There are also, there are both elements in Waking in December. There's the formalistic kind of poem, and there's the very free verse-oriented narrative sort of poem. Both elements repeat themselves in elephant bathing. I don't see it as a deviation of a serious nature from what I'd started off doing in my first book. Hopefully it's an improvement. Mughal sequence, on the other hand, feels like I feel I've tried something new over there, technically anyway.
It's not like elephant bathing happened and then Mughal sequence happened. These were clearly poems that were happening simultaneously.
Not at all. In fact, books of poems, as you know very well, don't tend to happen in that fashion. I started writing these Mughal poems while I was working on the poems in elephant bathing. Strangely enough, it happened the moment it was announced that my ancestral house is being sold. And Jeet Thayal strolled into my room one morning and complained over coffee that Indian poets, whatever that means, don't write enough about things like history, and we only write about ourselves. And he was in one of those moods. And there were these books of history, and I just thought of Humayun losing his empire, and a poem began. Then there were so many other themes, and this was actually evolving into a completely separate book of poems on a single theme. The elephant bathing poems were also being written during this period. But there was a good 4 or 5 months when I only worked on Mughal sequence. And I began to see it as possibly a separate book. Definitely a separate section in a book.
Because the last section in elephant bathing is already a series from the Mahabharata, am I right?
that was written long before. It's true, I started working with dramatic monologue long ago, at least 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Those poems were written before Waking in December was published, in fact. I was reading them. I just didn't put them into Waking in December because they were not complete. They were in little fragments, and it took me a while to bring them round. But yes, I mean, there's nothing like a new mode. It's all been done. It's how you do it. Tennyson wrote Tithonus. And